you don't casually become a competent person. Right? If you find it difficult to write a compelling CV of record to be reviewed by your peers, that's probably told you something.
Today I'm speaking with Steve Hunt. Steve is the chair of the JORC committee, and we cover everything JORC. We're talking about what JORC is, who is on the JORC, why is it there to do what it does, and why is it changing. So we're going to cover quite a few of the changes that are coming at us, and we're getting into some of the deeper parts like the competent person issue at the moment as well. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Let's get into it. Hey Steve, how's it going?
Yeah, good. Nice to catch up.
A bit jet lag still from PDAC, or?
No, I got over that last week, but it was it's a sign of the times that an overseas trip was actually exciting.
Yeah.
So the first time I'd been out of the country in 3 years, so had to find the suitcase and everything.
Was it a good trip, or what was the sentiment like? How did it go for you?
Look, I think there was, my first reflection is that there was quite a broad range of commodities, all of interest at the same time. There was a lot of attendance. I think a lot of people just happy to be there, but good conversations and people feeling pretty positive, particularly around the battery minerals cluster.
Nice.
There's copper, nickel, lithiums, etc.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was really bummed that I couldn't be there. I mean, it's a big trip to make from New Zealand, but the attendance was pretty huge. So I'm sure you.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, no, excellent. Well, hey, look, the reason I wanted to catch up with you is obviously so much happening in JORC space, and no other person better to speak to than yourself. So maybe before we dive into that sort of that discussion, give us a bit of a background on how you got I guess professionally in the work that you do, your background, and how you got into JORC, I guess, and maybe give us a bit of a summary.
Look, a lot of years to try and work through. I'd had a period in my career, so I had 20 years in the gold industry, primarily in mining, geology and resources areas. And the back half of that I spent as an expat in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea at a mine called Kalian in Indonesia, and then over at Lahia from the time it started up. I'd been signing off as a competent person. When I came back into Australia in the early 2000s, I thought it might be useful to engage and perhaps give back. And so early on in the piece, I joined the JORC committee at that stage. As life imitates art, I found that my main job at that point, as I came back into a corporate role with Rio Tinto, evolved around the resources and reserves governance piece within Rio, and I ended up looking after the group-wide resource and reserves processes and sign-offs, and that evolved into being part of the Rio Resources and Reserves Committee, and so that turned into sort of a parallel between being on the JORC committee outside of the business and working in similar space inside the business. And I was in that sort of role until about 18 months ago, when I've left Rio. I'm now working for a consulting group. So, interesting to see, throughout the course of my career, I've worked for juniors and mid-caps and majors. And I've
this
seen
is
the
maybe
full spectrum.
You've seen this full, that's exactly how I was going to, because seeing the full spectrum, because one thing that you see a bit is people who struggle with the concept of JORC for whatever reason, they throw the old JORC is created by consultants for consultants, but you obviously didn't come to this from a consulting space, right? I mean, what's your take on that? Obviously, as a consultant myself, I need to know the JORC and we need to apply it. And, you're across most of the aspects. Is there a difference between what consultants do with JORC and what the corporate world does with JORC? Or what would you say to that argument?
I think we've all got blind spots, and our biases are towards where we practice. And so people who use JORC to generate resource and reserve statements and public reports have got a different viewpoint than investors that read them. And they've got a different point than companies that have got, governance needs. And so I think we all see our bit as the most important bit, and we all forget that the other bits are part of the construct.
Yeah.
And so it can be seen that it's just about one part of it.
Yeah.
I think the reminder for everyone is that, JORC had its origins in the nickel boom and things that, led to investment bubbles and issues. And, for that point, 43101 had its inception in Busang. And so, everything's fine here, let's not worry about it, is always the case until it isn't.
Yeah.
And then you ask yourself, well, what are sort of a reasonable framework and a way to report so there's understanding?
Yeah. So, but the committee as it stands, because I had a question as well, like a lot of people don't really know who's on JORC, and there's obviously a website where you can find out quickly enough. But how does one get involved with JORC? How does that work? Is it a bit of shoulder tapping? I mean, there seem to be a pretty wide range of people with industry backgrounds on there. There's obviously ASX representatives on there. There's corporate representatives. There's consultants. Is the balance right? And how does the committee deal with getting new people on board who have an interest in this space? How do they learn about this? How do they get in contact? What's the process?
Look, the three primary parent bodies of JORC, the AusIMM, the AIG and the Minerals Council of Australia, and each of those groups has a number of representatives. So the Minerals Council is bringing in people from the mining company side, so they are part of that mining company association. The member bodies, the two institutes, are bringing them from the professional members. There's quite a balance of people on the committee we tend to bias more towards the geosciences, but we need to remember that the vast numeric majority of the reporting that happens is around the exploration phase, and so that's not actually a problem.
Yeah.
We have from time to time had to push fairly hard to make sure that our other disciplines are properly represented, and so to make sure that we can have mining engineers, and we have a metallurgist on the committee at the moment. So from time to time, we have to try and go back to the parent bodies and say, hey, we really need these sorts of skills.
Yeah.
We've also got some representatives of the mining finances side, and so you're trying to get a cut through the viewpoint from the investors side as well as from the execution side with the mining professionals. Is it perfect? No, it's not. It's a voluntary job, so
exactly, it's volunteers, right?
Unpaid.
So, yeah.
So I can assure you, it hasn't enriched me at all.
Yeah.
I think getting that consolidated and balanced view across the entire industry and really from both from the investors and the practitioner side is always a challenge. But it's got to stay in focus.
Well, it's difficult, right? Because it's almost like a not-for-profit board with volunteers. I mean, how do you find balance of skills and at the level where it really provides that lid on governance, right? Where you really got the right balance of skills and background. That's not easy. And there's so many stakeholders in this entire JORC playing field as well, that makes it really hard to balance everybody's interest. And you add a little bit of volunteerism to it, and I'm sure, and then obviously with JORC changing, and we're going to chat about that in a minute, it's a forever changing piece that is difficult to manage, I'm sure.
It's fun.
It's a good way to describe it.
I think you've just got to keep a focus on maintaining the balance and actually having a range of viewpoints. You've got to, it's not just the professional background, it's the to be able to see the viewpoint of a junior explorer as much as a major producer, and to understand and getting the cover of the various phases from the beginning of exploration to mature mining projects. And so getting that skills bundle, it does tend to have people that have had then, they're into their 25, 35 years of experience, and because they've then worked across a range of those conditions. So.
Do you see that? Do you see this changing? Sorry to interrupt there, but do you see that model of volunteers? I mean, and we're going to come back on this later, but there's obviously more and more pressure on this from a regulatory perspective as well, where at some point you got to wonder, how do you find the time? Because in consulting, generally speaking, one doesn't work a 40-hour work week. Then there is something like JORC, and again, generally speaking, volunteers don't volunteer for one thing. They are doing a few other things on top of that. There's only so many hours in a work week. Can we continue to cover this with volunteers, or do you see that system staying the same, and maybe not in the next 2 years, but in the next 20 years? Do you see a shift here?
Oh, I think we have to come to a more sustainable approach. One of the things that we've done for this JORC code update is we've employed a full-time project manager to help us hang it all together, and that's been very successful for us in maintaining the momentum and managing our various work groups and the like. At some point we'll need a different way. JORC's currently funded really in a three-way split between the AusIMM, the AIG and the Minerals Council, and so our funding model is there's not a lot of cash to throw around, but I do think we'll need to find a better way. What we've committed to doing is firstly getting through the update, but the very next item on the table after the update is to come up with a range of options for how we can manage the committee structure and oversight and the long-term trajectory, because it's a world becoming more complicated. Yep. And the expectations of professionalism and maintaining the momentum actually don't care whether you're a volunteer or not.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned a revision a few times. Maybe for people who don't know what's going on with this revision, why do we need one? What's wrong with the code as it was? Where are the holes, and what's the reason behind it?
I think we just need to recognise that typically about every 5 or 7 years since the inception of the JORC code, we've had an update. And so our last two updates were 2004 and 2012. It's now on my watch about 2022, so it's actually 10 years since the last JORC code update was worked through. Each of the updates looks around the pressure points in the code and the pressure points around disclosure. There's a number of things that have shifted remarkably in the last 10 years. One of them you would have to say is the broader ESG bundle around the reasonable prospects for development of a new mining project is now not just around how good your resource geology is and how good your economics appear to be. Your ability to be permitted and approved can be the critical path, and the social expectations and the investor expectations are critical. And so that's an area that was on the table about not getting the key principles of the code aligned to the expectations of investors. So where is the transparency around material risks in the ESG space?
And I had some people describe this to me as the fastest changing aspect in the industry that I've seen for a very long time, this ESG space. And you can almost sense that as well. And obviously every company, as much as the code, needs to adapt to that. So it's natural that you start with that topic. But given markets and people's propensity to overcorrect in when trying to solve problems. What are the risks here for companies that have resources? If we start with resources, how are we going to try not to oversteer here, and what are the risks? Do we have to downgrade resources at some point? Are we expecting this to come out of this update?
I think there's if a company has tried to bundle a very, very long-term view as their base case, there's always a risk that some of the things that were in the bag 10 years ago may well and truly be out of the bag today. Yeah. And that's not because of anything that the company has done, but the environmental legislation, the approvals processes are moving along with society. And so you don't get to keep on with your 1980s view of the world or even the 2000s view of the world, because today's investors want to see some of that sort of thing. Our code had barely any words in it around these modifying factors. They were in there as modifying factors, but they weren't expanded and there weren't checkpoints against them. And so none of this is around JORC trying to write a standard. This is JORC saying, how about you declare your material risks in this area?
Yeah, got it.
And so, the core principles of JORC of transparency and materiality are still the driver here. We can't say what's important to a particular project, but if it is important to the particular project and it should be something that the investors know about, it can't be invisible.
So is there a situation then that, let's say the JORC update comes out and there is this renewed focus on it, and it's, there's a spotlight on particularly ESG, which is enhanced by the general industry looking at it. Do boards now have to prepare for that and already be on the lookout for their competent person in ESG? Because that's obviously something that the institutes are focusing on as well in a competency building perspective, right? So that we have people who can actually comment on that side. But do people already have to prepare? And not everybody, obviously. I think you already gave part of the answer, but just to make it clear what people can expect. Some of these resources are obviously in interesting jurisdictions or interesting places, and where the E or the S or the G has clearly some role to play, and it hasn't really been touched on in the previous public report. Do people already need to line up their experts, and do these experts exist? And do we have we got the balance right in terms of finding these people and bringing them in on time to provide the right commentary to these resources? Because resources are done by geologists. And I'll come to the point of contributing experts in a moment, but is that part of the solution, or should companies have a little bit of an anticipation of what's coming here? What do we need to worry about?
I'll answer by an example. At some point in time, we used to drill into the mineral deposit, understand it, develop a resource statement, and have a long view of the economics and of the extractability of the product, and say, we're good. If the northern third of that mineral deposit is under a wetlands for which there's no process to get permits to disturbance, then that's an example of there being a shadow over part of what perhaps in previous days might have been a resource, but for which there is no credible path to development. And that's an area where even at a resource stage, an early view of the ESG likelihoods is important, because otherwise you go and release a 500 million tonnes resource, and perhaps by definition 40% of it has no pathway. Now, that should not be invisible to your investors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's an easy version if everything's already there. Yeah. The stress points, I think, across the entire industry, and they're real, where the mining licensing processes are becoming more fraught and more difficult, and no one actually knows what the process will be in 5 or 10 years. And so that's impossible for someone to have an early view on. You can flag where you are today, but you'll probably just have to adjust when the rules change. That is tough for everybody, but that's actually the reality of life. The rules in some areas are changing, and we will have to respond to them. So it's not easy to take a long-term forward view on things, but a lot of the key evidence points are there around what doesn't cut. The approvals processes in many areas right now, and where the trend lines are going.
Mm-hmm.
There are other areas of ESG too that come in. So, we're fast approaching the point in deciding which mining case to develop, that companies will be looking for which of these 2 or 3 mining options has the lowest long-term carbon footprint.
Sure, yeah.
And so our professionals are going to have to get their heads around is we don't just have to deal with the other technical and economic areas, but actually the potential impact can determine whether you get held up in approvals processes, or you get to approve a least impacting or a less impacting version of your mine plan. Now,
maybe that's a good point to
that's
just
a
to bring
tough
in.
one, right?
It is a tough one, yeah, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of challenges ahead. And obviously, when the new code comes out, people will need to upgrade their resources to a 2022 or 23, depending on the timing, JORC report, and that will be a challenge. How are we going to weave the concept of these contributing experts in without? I mean, it's still to be finalized, obviously, but where is it likely to skate towards? I mean, particularly in these, non-technical, well, that's probably not the right term either, because they're all technical contributions, but at the non-classic, geology, metallurgy space, is it an environmental consultant or permitting or any other particular skill sets? How do we build this in the solution?
Yeah, well, look, we're looking to bring in an expert or a specialist layer into the competent person space. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. If a single competent person tries to stretch their sign-off over all of these discipline areas, they can't be credible. All right? Not because they're not great people, but they can't be expert across the full span.
Yeah.
It's just not feasible. We need a mechanism to bring in the specialist work at the right level to build into, particularly at the reserves end, the construct of the ore reserves. The protocols we'll try and work through, and it'll come out in our public review in the near future, is that the competent person is still signing off for the entire construct, which is that the provided information has been appropriately used in the reserve case, because only they have that sight. But then the contributing specialist areas, those specialists can be identified and named in the public report as contributing the environmental or the social or whatever. And we're looking for a definition of what that specialist means. And it's of a similar equivalent in terms of experience and professional membership to the competent person. So they're experienced professionals in their area. But some of those specialist areas, by definition at the moment, can't be members of our 2 institutes. And so we need to find a way that the good information from credible experts is provided and comes into the construct that gets signed off by the competent person.
So as an example...
It's a protection for the competent person, not the stretch where they can't. Actually.
No, exactly, and that's a good point. And I wanted to clarify that with an example. Take for instance a more esoteric resource, a seabed nodules resource. I sign off as a resource geologist on the resource estimation and sampling, but then when it comes to defining the resource, classifying the resource, and I need to demonstrate RPEE, I rely on a dredging expert in Holland. and they are not a member of the OSMM or the AIG,
right.
and they are not, quote unquote, a competent person, but they are clearly an expert in dredging, and I have a conversation with them, and they contribute specialist advice on whether it's feasible to dredge these nodules up, and based on that, I say, look, it ticks the RPEE box, and here's a contributing expert. Is that sort of the thing we're thinking about?
That's a good example, Renee, and that's an example of where you couldn't. If that group wasn't identified, it would be, oh, look, Renee's just signed off on that. Where did he get that comfort from?
Yes, yeah.
And that's the perfect example of where perhaps some of the world experts, by definition, cannot be members of our mining societies.
Mm-hmm.
And so, getting the right expertise and getting them identified as being the source. But likewise, we still have to have that conversation that they know that their work is being appropriately applied, and that they also know that it's fit for purpose at that level of study.
Yeah.
And so, that interface still has to be there. But, the complexities that we're seeing across many projects is that we're really in a situation where, particularly in the reserve space, but also in advanced resources, that the current competent persons actually can't span that far.
Yeah.
And if they do, they're actually at risk of not properly understanding the risk contribution from that sector.
Well, so does this overlap a little bit with, and this may be a good segue to get into the competent person discussion, because that's what it all hinges on, and as competence being one of the three pillars of the code, there's a sideline discussion, well, it's not really a discussion going on the competent person. Can you just, update us how that sort of fits into this particular problem, and from a timing perspective as well, with the code being updated at the moment, the discussion about whether we need to change the competent person structure, if we call it that, how do you see the timelines, and what do you see the problems, and what should people know about in this space?
It's quite a bit to unpack. The stretch of competence is an issue. Part of the solution to that is probably in this contributing specialist space, and if that becomes part of the code update, that actually provides a bit of pressure relief in that space. The competent person process that we have is entirely trust-driven. People self-determine. They do have to be members. They do have to identify that, but there is no process by which any competent person can't decide to add a new area of practice between now and the end of the week. The vast majority of everyone practicing is doing it appropriately, but we're only as good as what we don't have in place, and we have had a number of complaints through the system of people under pressure or similar going into signing off on commodities or mining methods in which they wouldn't meet the JORC criteria of 5 years experience in that practice or that area. And so, one of the discussions we've had to have and to try and find a way through this is that the competent persons, are members of the AIG and OSIMM, and so this is actually a member matter as much as it's a JORC matter.
Right.
So we're going through a process around discussing what that could be. There's a range of things around pre-identifying your areas of practice, and that going through an administrative process. As sort of an end, there are questions around continuous professional development. There are questions around whether this becomes a member level. A lot of that discussion's got to happen inside the two institutes, and ultimately it's got to work through that sort of timeline of engagement and feedback and making sure that we're not overcooking. but we are improving.
Well, that's maybe that overcooking. I mean, we touched on it before. I mean, overcorrecting, it really comes from the drive, right? Where's the drive coming from? Because there's clearly an argument being floated that, regulating this entire system, somebody needs to regulate the output, if we call it that. Quality control the output. And in any system, anything that produces anything of value, it's about quality control. And ironically, that's obviously one of our most favorite terms to throw out in any Table 1 in a JORC report. It seems ironic that we have this extensive quality control process to comment on, and then right at the end where the report is due, you say, to hell with that, you can comment on your own competence. And from a regulator perspective, who arguably don't have line of sight at the operational level where they truly have either time or capability to unpack every disaster or train wreck, is it an argument to say, look, there is an over-regulation or there's an oversteering coming from this problem, and isn't it just about inserting better checks and balances? And that indeed needs to be driven at an institute level. Yeah,
look, I think a bit to unpack there, but I mean, to lay it on the table, if qualified persons in Canada have been subject to a registration process, right, for the last decade or so under their CSA rules and 43-101, we've only had to be members of our professional institutes. You can become a member by turning up with your degree and some referees. But none of that talks about your areas of practice.
Exactly.
So there's enough pressure coming back from regulators. I've had multiple with the committee, multiple meetings with ASIC. They tend to focus on when things go bad. That's actually their job. I like to typify the competent person thing about if I ask the general question, have we all seen areas where there are issues in the competency space, there's usually a strong positive. If I in any way suggest that the person I'm talking to is incompetent, I get a very strong emotional no, I'm perfect. But if I say, what about those guys over there? They say, yeah, they're terrible and something needs to be done. So as humans, we can carry those three independent ideas in our heads quite comfortably.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's not about questioning everyone's individual competence. It's about setting up a system that discourages the people that aren't there yet from signing off, and has a mechanism to, pre-qualify, pre-screen the areas in which people are operating, not to stop them spreading into new areas, but to mean that they can't do it under intense pressure before Friday afternoon.
Exactly.
So if you want to add a competency area, you run it back through your institute and you go through a process. That's fantastic. You can't do it. If your boss turns up Friday morning and says, sign off on this by Friday afternoon, you can't.
Well, that seems fair, and there's clearly some call it low-hanging fruit that we can capture in this review process, right? And that seems totally fair. But you just mentioned the Canadian reporting regime as well, and there's some signs coming out. I mean, it's all on social media in the last few weeks that arguably, regulators are also increasing their watch, if you like, if that's a soft phrasing to use. And the recent case of a qualified person being challenged on not being able to report on drilling results by at the same time being one of our most respected members in the geostatistical community with decades of experience. Is it, and I want to come back to this point because I've been, as you know, we have been thinking about this long and hard for some time now. It's fair to say that the public reporting quality could be improved. Like, let's find some common ground. I think we can probably all agree that not everything that comes out is perfect. Some of it is arguably far less than perfect. Almost nothing, and I should probably qualify that with numbers, but if you have discussions, it's never really people trying to play with the numbers on purpose, right? I've heard mentions of 1 in 400 cases that very experienced consultants have seen where the wool's being pulled over people's eyes quite dramatically. Now, there's obviously shades of gray of that, and we'll leave that for what it is. But if you agree that clearly there is an argument to improve, and if we would have as a community, as a scientific or a geological community or engineering community, have that conversation with the regulator, then we can probably agree on that. But if the regulator is putting the argument down of, hey, look, we've had X million dollars of shareholder loss, and that's because of that table 1, that resource, and that variogram was incorrect, and we'll put the resource geologist against the wall and strip him of his title. I don't think that's necessarily fair. And obviously, these arguments are very difficult to unpack, but one of the reasons is that, hey, look, their resource models, they're going to be wrong, and sometimes they are going to be wrong, whatever we do. Now, I don't like that argument because, that's obviously why we do what we do. We try to build in enough, we err on the side of caution, right, to quote the code. So we should not get it wrong on the upside, we should get it wrong on the underside, right? And those are some safety catches. But when you drill down into some of these cases, just to come to my point, and I've had a number of other interviews and discussions with people, it's not necessarily just that competent person with just that variogram and just that software. And, there's a whole layer of, particularly with bigger companies, politics and pushing between people and timelines and budgets and, more politics and people with shareholder interest and all sorts of mixed, there's bullying happening on various levels. A lot of competent persons are extremely passionate about being put on the pressure. It is pretty damn hard, and you notice as signing off as a competent person yourself, to wade through all of that, right? And is it necessarily fair that we single out these cases, not that they have been singled out and named, but that we single out cases and say, look, we've evaluated all these cases, it's the competent person, fix that and everything shall be fine. I think it's fair enough that we take a step back and say, look, there is definitely a competency to be improved. As I said, if you look at an average section of table 1s in public report, you go, cheapers, we can certainly improve on this. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say we need to shoot the competent person, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, look, and I think the idea that, it's all about shooting the competent person, I think is oversimplistic. There are always a whole lot of reasons, why projects fail. Some of those are well out of the reach of the competent person. So the corporate entity's approach to how they finance, and whether they're in the bond market or the lenders of last resort and are very highly geared, is something that the competent person can't even see. That's the board makes that decision. But likewise, the idea that because it's not a frequent event, it doesn't need fixing, I don't think holds water either. Just letting it doesn't happen very often, so it's okay. Well, good, When you drive home in the middle of the night, run every red light, right? Yeah. On average, you won't die. Occasionally, you will. And so regulators have a job to do. We don't want to get into the sort of the Canadian space where the regulators are trying to tighten up regulations around how resources are reported. We need to own this in our institutes, in our environment.
Okay.
One of the great strengths we have in our home environment for JORC is that our professional bodies in the AusIMM and ARG are national bodies. And so, to have those conversations in Canada, you're talking to the engineering and the geological groups in every single province, trying to reach consensus, which is very hard. And to some extent, that's why the regulators actually ended up writing the rules. So the alternative is actually for us to see there is that if we don't look to ways to improve, and there's a matrix of controls, not a single control, sooner or later the regulators point at the bad ones and they try and write the rules. And that's not actually a very good outcome.
No, I completely agree with that. And there's obviously many aspects to fixing this problem. And what you just said sort of prompted me to get into the next question. Is there something in the complaints process itself that is part of the problem? Because, as we well know, the only reason why something would get the light of day is that another person of the public or a member, complains about another competent person. But as we all know, after a 60-hour work week on Friday night, the last thing you're going to do is sit there and type a 2-page complaint about something. And if you are that passionate about it, the chances are that you have a conflict of interest anyway, and that you can't actually lodge that complaint. So if we look at the number of complaints dropping, coming through that process, and the number of complaints on the ASX side going up, to me, that tells you a very clear message. Our complaint system is broken, and you call them speeding tickets when they are to do with JORC transgressions, competent person statements, and all that sort of bit that people clearly need to know about. And I like that analogy, but even those are not really being pushed through that system, because again, those complaints committees, they are also volunteers, and they meet once every month or 2 months, and that's not the time frame to handle with extremely market sensitive complaints at times. So is that complaints review process part of the solution in your view?
I think it is, and I think it needs to be designed for a clearer process around early checking, fast checking on whether there's a material issue, and then working through on the things that survive that early test. If it's a speeding ticket type issue, which is something that the ASX can manage, so if someone hasn't put the right sign-off tables or some of the structure of the reporting is missing, there's not necessarily a straight line that says that it was in any way misleading. So you can do perfectly balanced reporting and forget to include some of the critical information. That should be picked up with a speeding ticket, but that's not pointing to a deeper issue other than clumsiness.
So where do I go? Where do I go? So about a year or two ago, and I can't remember the name, and that's probably a good thing. A couple of years ago, a resource was reported on the market, and it was an inverse distance resource with a power factor of 0.1. Right? Where do I go with that complaint? Because that makes no sense, and any resource geologist you ask, it makes no sense. So that's a competency issue. So where do we go with that?
That one's a competency issue, and that's where the institute processes need to be improved, because that should go through an early test that says, no, this isn't a formatting, public report structure issue, and even the important ones like the competent person statement are missing. Doesn't mean that the underlying data is not good, but an estimate that just doesn't make sense to an estimator is flags a competency issue.
That's clear cut.
That's quite clear cut. One of the mechanisms with the idea that your CV of record that defines your areas of practice exists before a complaint means that it can be checked against a complaint. One of the structural issues we have is that when people act as a competent person now, their actual experience supporting that decision is invisible.
Yeah.
When there's a complaint raised, the committees are looking on LinkedIn. I've sat in meetings with the state and federal regulators across the mining of Australia and New Zealand in the last 6 months, and they all say when they get something submitted that doesn't look right, they can't find out who's actually signed off as the competent person. They can see a member number, but they can't see that there's where the experience of that person is.
So the institutes need to take some responsibility and create that framework for people to have access to the information to look up without having to go to LinkedIn, obviously. It's like, look, does this person really have the background and the knowledge and the skill? I mean, it's not the solution, but it's an easy fix. It's a low-hanging fruit.
It's quite a low-hanging fruit, and it's not, you don't casually become a competent person, right? It's not, if you find it difficult to write a compelling CV of record to be reviewed by your peers, that's probably told you something.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you're scared that that becomes a public record, that's telling you something too.
Yeah, for sure.
You should be able to stand and defend your ability to act as a competent person in that area to your peers, and feel confident you can do so. So it's just making that a public record.
Yeah.
That's certainly some feedback we've had from a number of directions. None of that is about disempowering people that are well experienced, but it's a way that could speed up the complaints process. The other thing it does is to provide just a process control on adding new areas of competence without going through and amending that sort of documentation.
Yeah.
And so, those things are useful.
Now, look, that's very clear, and thanks for putting that out there. I mean, there's obviously some fairly easily implementable solutions there, and maybe that's a good point to raise as well. I mean, none of these changes or fixes or discussions, if they haven't landed on any firm changes yet, they're not just driven from 50 mysterious people sitting around a dark table making up decisions. I mean, there have been 500 submissions of members with thoughts and ideas about how to fix that. How to fix a whole bunch of these issues or issues that they've raised, right? There has been quite an extreme consultation, and we're listening to pretty much whoever comes up with an idea. It's been put on the list and it's been filtered through the system, right?
Yeah, look at the COVID knocked us around in our early attempts to get the code updated, and so we did revert back to the sort of large public survey process through 2020 and into early last year. And there were over 500 submissions, and predominantly from people that had a lot of exposure to the code. And the broad area of competence, stretch of competence, better complaints processes.
Yeah.
They all came out quite strongly in that survey.
Yeah.
So we said that to ourselves as a broader industry.
Yeah.
I think, as I said earlier, it can become personalised as I feel competent to say that person over there isn't, but don't question me. That feedback loop is real. This isn't some process to disenfranchise the competent from acting as they do. It's better backup to their position, but it's also to encourage people not to overstretch. And I think the secondary sign-off specialist process, I think, will be a great help in that area. For your own good. Don't be the only person that says you've checked everything in areas that you have no professional practice.
No, that makes sense.
It's just not clever, right?
No, it isn't. It's a good point to make. And I think if we just stand still on that feedback process, I mean, it seems clear that the feedback that we're getting, both through that consultation process and these two discussions that we just had in Brisbane and Perth, the majority of our industry, of our peers, are actually looking for change, right? It's not like, again, I want to focus on this change aspect a little bit. I mean, there's obviously the regulator who are signaling that some change is needed. Our membership seem to be quite supportive of change. But change is an interesting thing, right? Because as I joked, I think last time I saw you, who wants change? Yes, everybody. Who wants to change?
Nobody.
Nobody. But there is a clear sentiment that change is upon us, right? And that is being supported by the broader membership. Is that how you see it as well?
Well, I do. I think you've got to look at this code update as the code for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Not the last 10 or the last 20.
Yeah.
What should we... how can we improve the broad quality? I think around the competency piece, it's multifaceted. Our complaints process needs to work through. The nomination and verification protocols, whatever they are, need looking at. The overstretch piece needs a solution in its own right. And this is like a mesh of things that work together. I don't think any of those turn into any form of barrier for the professional and competent. I do think they should be a discouragement from people moving into acting as a competent person before they're ready.
Yeah, and that's fair
And
enough.
I don't apologise for that. I think that's appropriate.
No, neither should we. Yeah.
And because you should never get a complaint around someone who's moved in and has already signed off and only has 3 or 4 years experience in that area.
And maybe that's a good point to make. And as you talk about the reasons for change, I mean, another thing that people might not have a full appreciation of is the branding aspect of JORC and the change over the last decade or two, right? I mean, the commercial aspect of the word JORC, I mean, the way it's now being used or has been used for some time now, the JORC report, right? People want that JORC stamp of approval, right? And that obviously touches on that clear distinction between, you know, a public report that is written in accordance with the JORC and the actual work underpinning it. And that a lot of jurisdictions outside Australia are still looking for that JORC stamp because that gives access to that funding, right? And there is also a broader discussion or a broader problem to fix, if you like, how JORC is used in other jurisdictions. And we've discussed the AIM in London for some time as a classic example of where the supporting information is incorrectly perceived to be less than what we need in Australia. And now there's various other codes or various other jurisdictions applying JORC are looking for it. So there's also a commercial aspect to this that we need to be safeguarding ourselves towards.
Yeah, look, I think there's always a risk that you become a flag of convenience. That's a problem. The investors in all markets understand that getting a sign-off of a resource under JORC with a competent person has a meaning to investors. It's not just JORC. Sometimes, similar off-market reports are generated using the 43101 template. But they're never reported back to CEDAR in Canada either.
Yeah.
And so the problem with this area is that the JORC protocols and the sign-offs are used, but they are not reported to a market in the same way. And so the market controls don't necessarily exist, or a truncated version of the report that would be presented in Australia is actually presented.
Yeah.
And that's a problem in its own right. And so you can get this, wide anting, I suppose, of the full integrity package that would happen in your home market. Yeah. The other piece that's actually on the up, and I had engaged with the mines departments around our home area, is that we are using then JORC reports for submissions to government around lease upgrades and lease retentions. And at times they are JORC reports written for non-public, prospector partnerships.
Yep.
And so there again is another version where there's a JORC report generated that doesn't have the full public review that would happen if it's going to the market.
Well, and there's another problem in that piece, coming back to the Canadian format or the NI 43101 format. At least there, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get that format with the chapters in the same place. That's an NI 43101 report. If people ask for a JORC report, what even is that, right? And you obviously in the code we talk about the technical documentation underpinning the actual public report, and on our side, or if you call it that anyway, we talk about the public report being most of the time a public announcement, right? Yes. So if you then have these JORC reports that go to the regulator, for instance, in New Zealand, there's no specification of what that needs to look like. So to bend it into a question, I'm quite a fan of, as much as I'm a detractor, I mean, you can't have it all, I guess, but I'm quite a fan of the NI 43101 format in many ways because you know what you're going to get and you know where to look for certain stuff. And obviously our table 1 was meant to answer some of those questions, but it's not really worked the way we had intended to. So there's obviously some changes coming in that space. What's your view on how do we align this, or should we align it and is it good as it is, or is there a benefit of going to a full technical report, because then at least we are on par with the other largest reporting jurisdiction in the world and we answer some of those questions?
I'll answer that in 2 parts. The first part is that the distinction that the public report is drawn from the competent person's documentation is an area that we're looking at in the clause updates, and the putting the stake in the ground that the competent person's documentation has to exist. The competent person's documentation is not the press release.
Yeah.
Right? If it doesn't exist, and only, it's more than the table one, what do we all do in life? There are resource reports that are very, very thick documents exist. That's the competent person's documentation. The documentation of the mine planning process that's given you your maiden reserve is a document. It's not the press release. Yeah. So getting that piece clearer in the code, because I think there's been differing views, and that's one of the areas that will come out in the commentary paper.
Yeah.
The other element, which is, the reason we have a CEDAR database in Canada is because that's what the regulators asked for. And so if we don't get better about improving our stuff, that's one of the options the regulators still have.
Yeah.
It's not the be-all and end-all. I think we've all seen some pretty good 43-101 reports, and we've also seen ones that follow the format perfectly and they still look like rubbish reports.
Yeah, for sure.
So, getting the format right doesn't solve the problem if there is underlying data. We're not at the moment considering, a full, public database of such, but there will be changes in the table one and around what I would frame as a rebalancing of the modifying factors.
Yeah.
So additional elements in the table one, clarifying ES&G, clarifying in the clauses as well as the table one what the reasonable prospects protocols have been, and also clarifying the adding a few extra things that weren't in there and clarifying, like reconciliation, getting a clearer definition and a clearer expectation set.
Yes.
So some of those areas will be improved, and it's trying to get, as I said, the view for aligning where JORC is in now a 10-year-old code. And there have been some changes in our Crisco partner codes in that last 10 years. And so, some of the table one formats that other Crisco codes have adopted in the meantime we're looking at. And even the secondary experts layer is something that the US have adopted in the SK 1300. And so there are ways in there which I think bring us in lockstep with similar codes.
Yeah, it does, but
without being identical, yeah.
Yeah, but we don't need to be identical, obviously. If there's a better way to do it, then we'll do it. But, there's also a reinventing the wheel kind of part of this discussion. And the risk, I guess, that, we already have in the public report the 5.8.1 listing rule, so we have to almost duplicate, what we say about sampling and drilling in the body of our report, and then we repeat it again in a table one. Now there's going to be enhanced reporting around, risk reconciliation, RPEE, and a few other ESG. Do we run the risk that we turn this public report into, a 50-page document without real rhyme or reason, without real structure, where people actually still don't know where to put stuff? And is there an argument to make, not for now, but maybe in the future, to suggest, hey, look, let's go back to that slightly more marginal, clearer public report that, that's the announcement. And then what I actually recommend to our clients, because when we write our full technical report, for us, it's turned into a hybrid over the years. If we write a JORC technical documentation to underpin a public report, we put quite a bit of time in that because we expect that obviously at some point to be made public either to a third-party investor or to another consulting group, and there's, it needs to stand the test of time. That report, just like an NR 43-101 report on CEDAR, they could put it on their website, right? And then it's made public, and then all the information with all the pretty pictures about the variograms and all the detail about the ESG can lie in there, and we maybe just summarize a few things in our public reports. Is there a hybrid solution possible there? Or?
Look, I think, in our environment, everyone's had the ability to post additional data on their website.
Yeah.
And in my view, some of the clever groups actually do that. The JORC's a minimum standard, so the minimum standard will be if you're out there with your first release resource or reserve, you're at least the table 1 has to be released.
Yeah.
And that's because no one has heard about it before. It's your brand new resource or reserve, so it's actually setting the expectations. There's a criticism, which is reasonable at times, that the table 1 is only intelligible to the technical folk, but that can also be the people that work for the key investors, and that the front end of the public report verbiage was to make sure that at least the headline elements were put in plainer language in a condensed form up the front. Yes, it is written twice. I think one of the difficulties is the people that read the front half and the people that read the back half aren't necessarily the same people.
Yeah, and that's fair enough.
But to disenfranchise either of them creates a different set of problems.
Yeah.
And one of the points around the original Table 1 coming into the last code update was that you can't peer review or check for technical reasonableness a blank sheet of paper. And so if that wasn't there, you've got nothing to look at.
Yeah. No, you need something. Yeah.
How did they do their sampling? How did they estimate? What are the mining assumptions, etc.? And so at least it puts them on paper and it gives a high-level view, and it can help that sort of sniff test. Is there anything that doesn't add up here? But it does still only mean something to people with a technical background
for sure. Yeah.
But to take it away means that it's all about the high-level opinion in the front, not backed up by
that can be dangerous.
Anything that can be reviewed for reasonableness.
Yeah.
So it gets us right back into I've signed off, my opinion's good, but you can't check in my homework.
Trust me, I'm an expert.
Trust me, I'm an expert.
Yeah.
Which is a nice concept, but I don't think it cuts it.
No, look,
in our modern world, right?
No, it does. I mean, and we see the evidence of that on a daily basis. So I agree with that. And look, I think we'll probably move towards closing it off. But you mentioned already a few other of the changes that are happening. Reconciliation is going to be a focus on that. I think I brought up risk. We need clearer discussions on risk in these reports. I think that's a fairly simple one. Can you maybe, as a final comment on these changes, RPEE, soon to be RPEE, what in a nutshell, what was the problem there, and how are we going to try and address some changes in that space?
Well, eventual was interesting. It can be the out clause for any form of unreasonable that's saying that will become reasonable through time. I think the biggest area around the reasonable prospects test is whatever reasonable prospects test was occurring wasn't necessarily commented on. So what we're after in the code update is just the framing process by which that's been tested rather than opinion. I think this is good somewhere in the next 100 years, is not... and particularly if not qualified by any of the underlying assumptions, is wow. Well, how do you deal with that? Again, it's a high-level filter. How do you deal with zero cut-off grades? How do you deal with infinite stripping ratios? What's the process by the reasonableness that has been evaluated? It's not trying to turn a resource into a reserve.
Yeah,
that's not the point. The point is just to get rid of the gap between the infinite inventory under the surface and which part of it has actually been assessed to be resource.
And that's fair enough. But here's a hypothetical situation for you. How do we deal with this going forward, even after this new update? I'm a resource geologist. I decide either being pressured by my client to use a commodity price 4 times the current price to create my pit shell, because we're now all using pit shells to come up what is reasonable, because we apply some sort of justification, particularly if we're not next door of the other gold mine at the same cut of all those sort of standard situations. So we've got a new area, we found some stuff, we've modeled it. We can't just report all the blocks in our model, because that wouldn't pass the sniff test. We run a quick pit optimization with some basic assumptions, but we really want to use a price that is 4 times the copper price. Call it $12. And that's my opinion. Where do I go? And I put that out there. I've written all beautifully up. I tick all the reporting boxes. I talked about it. I say exactly why I want to use the $12 price. Is it just, hey, look, that's fine. It's out in the open and people can see for themselves whether that's rubbish or not? Or should there be a process like, look, that's just rubbish. You just can't do that. That's just not competent.
I think the first test has always got to be, if you're going to be extra special because you're extra special, you better be declaring it, right? So you can't claim to be, we've got a different view of the metal price than the entire industry, and that's our base case. Well, that better be clearly declared, because it's material to the size of the number.
It is.
And if it was only twice the metal price, would you have 80% of those tonnes or 15% of those tonnes? Critical question.
Yes.
And so
let's make it 15%.
Yes. Well,
because this might not be a hypothetical. So
yes,
it's yes.
So I think outlining the basis for your reasonable prospects is part of the solution too.
Yeah.
So it's not one of the issues that's always been in that case, particularly with long view resources, is that the basis for the reasonable prospects at times it hasn't been declared at all.
Yeah.
There can be cut-off grades not related to any reasonable mining or process method. There can be geometries that aren't extractable. And the idea that you can have the biggest possible number and then just lose 70% of it when you convert to reserves, I don't think it's in the interest of investors either. Looks good at the time. So it's a good sugar hit, but isn't necessarily either fair nor reasonable.
Yeah.
And
or it could trigger some clause in somebody's contract to release some sort of payment, some sort of bonus payment based on the resource.
Then there's a clear conflict of interest, and that should be not invisible. So, my answer to all these things is, if it would cause embarrassment for that material factor to be released, why hasn't it been released?
Yeah.
So, fall back on the key principles all the time, forgetting to remember to tell something about a material driver is a problem, and has always been the responsibility of the competent person. If we're having to overcook anything, I think through time, is we're putting in more prompts about don't forget to remember that you've got to look in this area too.
Yeah.
But still, it's not about having to go into long discussion around detail levels that aren't material.
Yeah.
If they're not material, that's fine.
Yeah. No, look, that's
say so, move on.
Yeah, no, it should be pretty clear. Now, good. It's been a great discussion. Look, what's next for Steve Hunt after this update in the JORC? I mean, you've been involved with JORC for such a long time, put blood, sweat, and tears in it. What's your game plan after this?
I'm ready to step back and let someone else have all the glory
and the fun.
And that's the plan. We'll have to transition the committee. We've got a number of the people that have been doing a lot of work in the committee that are looking to put a line through their contribution and move on.
Yeah, right.
So we'll have as we have typically at each update, there's been a substantial regrouping in the committee, and that'll come. And I might get some time back.
Yeah,
which is good.
Now, look, it's been great talking to you. Anything else that you think you want to cover off on this? I mean, we can probably talk JORC for hours, but that would, on a boring subject for some, would probably not help.
Yeah, look where we are with our process. The draft of the JORC code will be out for public review around the end of July. There'll be a review period, and we'll go back inside the tent and have a look at how that flows. The parallel process we talked about earlier around the competency framework within the parent institutes is also running in parallel. And, so we'll have to glue those things back together. And, we are talking about the code update becoming the code in 2023, not 2022, because even after we've finished all of our engagements and final drafting has to go through ministerial sign-off.
Right.
So that'll take its time, and then there'll be a transition period as we had previously.
Yeah.
So a way to go yet, but this next round of code drafts people can get into and put their red pens through won't be too far down the track.
Well, look, that's exciting. And, from my perspective, thanks so much for putting all that time in. I know how much time goes into these things. So, it's really built on volunteers. So really appreciate that. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me as well. Really, really great bunch of topics, and hopefully clarified a few things. And I'm sure if people have thoughts and questions, we'll find them in the comments, and that might find its way back to yourself as well. So I really appreciate it.
I'm sure we'll hear if there's any major concerns. It'll come out, which is good. I mean, it's we try. It's a big thing to wrestle, but we need the feedback.
No, for sure. Hey, look, good, Steve. Thanks so much, and we'll see you on the other side at some point if I make myself back over to Melbourne at some point and catch up with you there.
Thanks.
Good on you, man. Cheers.